Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Greetings, class. Good morning. Welcome. We're on a little bit of a delay. Daniel was having an internet connectivity issue where he was, so he is switching to a different academic building in Philadelphia. So he'll be on in a few minutes. So I thank you for your patience. Again, if you're just joining us, we are continuing our seminar on the history of Kanam Bournu, and Daniel has walked us through the first 2 weeks of the sources for the history of this long-lasting empire. Last week he talked about one of its most illustrious rulers, Idris Aluma, the Mai, or the ruler of Kanam Bournu. And today he's going to give us some more information concerning change in the empire. And I'll let him explain more about that when he comes on. So while we wait for Daniel to reconnect, I just want to give everyone a heads up about kind of where we're going in the next couple of weeks. So we have today's session for this seminar, and then we have next week, we will conclude our seminar. In May and June, we have our final course, our final 8-week course, which will deal with the early history of the African Renaissance. So we go from 1896 to the present. And every year that we do that class, it's done in a thematic way. So one year we did various meetings that occurred during that time period, and we talked about the significance of those meetings. Last year we did various pieces of literature that were published during that time period between 1896 and the present, and we broke down how those pieces of literature reflect the times that they were in. This year, we are going to use one book as our framework for discussing that period. We are going to be looking at Kwame Nkrumah's Class Struggle in Africa. Kwame Nkrumah's short book, Class Struggle in Africa, and the PDF of that will be available on the course website for anyone that would like to follow along. So every week for the 8 weeks, we will take a section of that book, we will examine it, and then we will look at the history of the African world since 1896 in relation to this book. So we're going to interrogate Nkrumah's ideas. The basic idea, if we look at what's going on in Africa in the 20th century, we can boil it down to a struggle between the oppressed and the oppressor. And that oppressor comes in various forms. And he gives different manifestations of that struggle. And he breaks it down between economic classes. So that's what we're going to look at. Now, we're not going to present Nkrumah's work as if it's flawless. We're going to critique it. We're going to match it up with historical realities of both the past decades as well as the present to see if his thesis actually matches up to reality. If his theory of class struggle in Africa actually matches up to what has been happening in the African world between African people as well as African people and their interactions with external forces, whether that be Europe, America, Asia, so on and so forth. So that's what we'll be doing in May and June. And then in July, as always, our cycle continues. So we go all the way back to the beginning and we do our course on African history from 10,000 BC to 711 CE. So we start that in July and August. So the cycle continues. We'll be entering our 7th cycle of this course, 7th or 8th. I'm starting to lose count. We started in 2018. So it will be the 7th cycle that we'll start in July and August. So I look forward to continuing that with you. So if you're enjoying what we do, keep coming, keep telling other people about these courses. Everything that we have done for the past couple of years is also available on YouTube, thanks to the folks here at BIA Media who are responsible for the live broadcast as well as archiving the material through YouTube. So if you miss anything, you could always catch up. If you want to refer people to the course, you can always, shoot them a link to one of the YouTube videos. They can kind of get an idea of what we do here. And as always, you are all invited anytime you're free, anytime you want to come down here to 235 Montreal Road into the studio and be a part of the actual live conversation. We have regulars, Robin's usually here. Sometimes Brother Prince comes here. We usually have students here. So come join us, join the conversation live the way we used to back at the Bronson Center or when we were meeting at Vicon Alexander School, in the early days of this course. So we're trying to build the community that way. So if you have the time, you have the availability, please come and join us every Saturday at 11 a.m. here at 235 Montreal Road. Has Daniel come back yet? No Daniel yet? Okay, so we're still waiting for Daniel. So as we wait, anybody have any announcements or questions that they want to ask about the course, about where we're going, any recommendations? The schedule for next year is still slightly open. So we do have our 4 regular courses. In July and August, we start the African History 1. And then in October, November, we have our Shiro's class. In January and February, or February or March, depending on how we do it, we have African History Part 2. And then in May and June, we have the Early History of the African Renaissance. So September, we have an opening for a seminar. December and possibly January, we have the opening of a seminar, the opening for a seminar, and April. So every year we have 3 sections of the year where seminars, 4-week seminars occur. And those are usually based off of topics that we've brought up in class, but we say this deserves a class by itself and we extend it. Or there are topics that are in the news that we want to explore in more detail. So those are still kind of open. I have some ideas for September. April, we might run the Malcolm X and Martin seminar again. I try to do that every other year. We didn't do it this year. We're doing this seminar on Kanam Bournu. So we might run Malcolm and Martin next April. But there's still the September and December, what we kind of want to learn about. I have some ideas brewing, but I like to get the input of other folks. If there's something that we've discussed that folks want to go in more detail on, or any ideas, if anybody has them. I know we did the Robeson seminar last September. Thought that went really well. We did the seminar on the Haitian Revolution as an ongoing revolution. We did that this December and January, and that led right into actually recent events in Haiti. And I think our class, if you took that seminar, would really open your eyes to what's actually happening in Haiti now and give you some historical perspective to have it make sense. So we kind of do those over the years. We've had one on the African student movement. We've had seminars on snitches and sellouts. We might have to do that again because that seems to always come up. So a number of ideas. We've done movies. We've done African cinema. We did that during the pandemic. So there are a number of options for those 2 months and possibly even April. All right, I'm talking too much. We're still waiting for Daniel, so I'll open it up. Any questions, comments? Robin, you have something? Go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of announcements, so the 3rd United Nations meeting of the permanent forum of people of African descent. Sorry, I got a bit of a thing. My voice is kind of weird. So that just wrapped up in Geneva. So we had a bunch of folks over there doing good work and stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a special hub meeting and then invite them to come and tell us, like, what happened, what were their goals, what they accomplished, and how can we support, like, what are the next steps getting ready for the next year's meeting of the forum in New York, right? It jumps back and forth between Geneva and New York. Yeah, so I invite them all to come and say, hey, what happened was, how can we support in preparation for next year, right? So,
right, yeah.
So that's that. On Monday, I'll be speaking at the, as I do every month, at the Ottawa Police Services Board meeting at 4:00. And the theme of what I'll be talking about is picking up on, I'm sure you guys all are familiar with this. Whenever anything happens, usually like especially shootings in black neighborhoods, the police always say there's no threat to public safety at this time. So my remarks are basically saying, okay, a couple of problems with that statement. One is the people in that neighborhood are members of the public, and are they safe? Like the people, are right? That's one thing. And the public is never safe from you, the police, ever, right? So when you talk, so basically what I do is I go through and I just list all the stuff that's happened for the last year, and then I end up after each paragraph I say, but the the OPS says there's no threat to public safety at this time, right? So so is that and then what else did I want to say? Oh, then there's wait a second. Oh, right. My trial, an update my trial. All right. So I had my libel trial against, right? Two black guys I sued from the former member or founders of the Federation of Black Canadians. We had the trial was supposed to run 3 days. So it did, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but it's been extended now. So we have what's supposed to be the final day on May the 16th, where I will be I'll be cross-examining Len Carby, and I'll be doing my final remarks, which so I will say, yeah, but when we get closer to that, I'll share the link. You get the same link that I've shared already, but the same one. And let me tell you, really interesting stuff, because this is a case where one of the issues is I call them house Negroes. So we have a bunch of black people with a white judge trying to decide the legality of black people calling each other house Negroes.
Historical event indeed. All right. So Daniel is ready. He's joined us. He's ready to take over. To answer the question in the chat, physically, yes, we are located in Canada. This is broadcasting from Ottawa, Canada. We are at a Black-owned studio, BIA Media, in the capital of Canada, in Ottawa. We're in a space that's dedicated to preserving the history and the current events of the Black community here. So that's where we're at. But of course, we broadcast all over the world with this course. And please share it with other people. And we're here. If you miss it because you're in a different time zone, we have the recordings. So I'm going to shut up. I'm going to turn it over to Daniel. And Daniel, the course is yours.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I apologize about my tardiness. I was having some technical difficulties, but we are in week 3 of our 4-week seminar on the history of Kanam Bournu. And last week, we talked about the establishment of the Sefua dynasty, and we talked about one of Kanam Bournu's most lionized kings, Idris Aluma. We looked at some of his military tactics. We looked at the relationships that he had with the Ottoman Empire. And we set that up to talk this week about the establishment of a new dynasty, one which is still sitting on the throne in Nigeria today. And so that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the destruction of the Sefua dynasty and the establishment of the Shehu dynasty in the 1800s. And so as a little callback, at the very beginning of class, we talked about how Kanam Bournu was one of the only states in Nigeria to not be conquered by the Fulani when they were launching their jihads across West Africa. In this class, we're going to look at why that is. And so to give a little bit of context, we can't talk about the Fulani jihads without talking about this man named Uthman Danfodio. He was a Fulani. He was making an effort to establish a new caliphate or sultanate in West Africa. And so he launched a series of jihads or holy wars, as they're called in Arabic, across Western Africa. Robert Smith tells us that in the first years of the 19th century, the reforming movement of the Fulani preacher Osman Danfodio swept through Hausaland, transforming the peaceful Muslim farmers there into a holy army bent on carrying the Quran to the sea. And so as these military and religious wars are going on in West Africa, These are going through Hausaland. These are going through the Yoruba city states. And at the same time, they start to go through the kingdom of Kanam Bournu. And so at the time that these campaigns go on, there's the Mai of Kanam Bournu is a man named Ahmed. And it's been a long time between his coming on the throne and the reign of Idris Aluma. And so in this span of about 300 years, there's been a decline in leadership. And so what was once a kingdom occupied by military warriors is now a throne occupied by people who are politically incompetent or inept, for a lack of better words. And so during his reign, one of the vassals of Canaan Bornu was a kingdom called Dea. And the king of Dea was named Lafia, and he was rebellious to Canaan Bornu. So my Ahmed deposed him and replaced him with his brother Salgami. Now, when King Salgami was sitting on the throne, the Fulani started to raid villages in their territory. And between Dea and Canaan Bornu was a village called Kalalawa. This was kind of like a buffer zone between the two. And the Fulani started to launch jihads against this town. And so my Ahmed decided to initiate counterattacks. And so what he did was he would get into a practice of sending his military generals over to the Fulani to try to war against them. But the oral traditions tell us that every time he would send a military general down there, they would show up, they would see the size of the Fulani armies, they would get fearful, and then they would draw back and return back to Kanem Bornu. Now, it was the custom of the Mais of Bornu that you wouldn't kill people for cowardice or for acts of treachery. So rather, what you would do is you would exile them to a neighboring village or a neighboring country. So 3 times my Ahmed had to send people down to deal with the Fulani, and all 3 times his generals got overwhelmed with fear and came back home. And so when he died, he had to leave the charge of his country to his son Dunama. And it wasn't until my Dunama took the throne that Kanem Bornu actually went to war against the Fulani. But unfortunately, as Heinrich Barth tells us, my Dunama was driven out of his capital by the Fulbe, or Fulani of Katagum, as it seems, in the end of 1226, which in the Gregorian calendar is 1811 AD, or at the beginning of 1227 or 1812 AD. Now, while he was making these wars against the Fulani, he had the military and political support of a man named Al-Kanemi. And he's going to be very important because it's him who establishes the second dynasty that rules over Kanem Bornu and completely demolishes the previous dynasty. And so he was very important because he helped Maidunama reclaim the capital city of Ngazargamu after the Fulani drove him from there not one, not two, but 3 times. He also was important because he launched a series of counterattacks against the Fulani. And because of his acts of service to the king, Maidunama gifted Al-Kanemi with a fief, which is basically like a province or an administrative district, at a place called Ngurnu, which was strategically located so that Al-Kanemi had both access to the common people and equally at the same time to the royal administration. Now, in the midst of the Fulani jihads, Kanem Bornu was growing weaker and weaker, and Al-Kanemi saw this as an opportunity to build an image of himself and to consolidate his power. And so while he was helping Maidunama fight the Fulani on one hand, he was actually using the situation to build himself up and establish a political presence at the same time. And so Lewis Brenner and Ronald Cohen say that he had built a personal following composed largely of pastoralist Kanembu and Shua Arabs. And this is important because these demographics represents his genealogy. One of his parents was an Arab, and his other parent was a Kanembu, or a person of Canaan. And so he was strategically building relationships with both people to build himself up. And so in doing this, he convinced two of his brothers-in-law to support him on a political level. And he had allied himself with three Malams, or Islamic religious teachers, who he had been studying with before the Fulani Wars. Now, Al-Kanemi was born in Fezzan, which was a region in Libya, and he had received Islamic education in Tripoli, which is in North Africa. And so he was using people that he had prior relationships with to side with him and help him build up this military force in silence. At the same time, around 1810, Kanam Bournu was divided over political factions. And so half of the country was split between supporting Maidu Nama, and the other half was split between supporting his uncle Muhammad Ingiliruma. Now, eventually, Maidu Nama ended up losing favor with the people, and he was replaced by his uncle. But after 3 years, he ended up getting put back on the throne because of this period of political instability. When Maidu Nama got back on the throne in 1813, Al-Kanemi was very instrumental in getting him back on the throne. And so because of his acts of service, the Mai gave him an even bigger piece of territory to rule over, which some sources describe as being up to half of the total territory that Kanam Bournu was in charge of. In 1814, a year after Maidu Nama took the throne back, he decided to leave Ngurno and build a town of his own, which he named Kukawa. So now, in addition to getting land from the king of Kanam Bournu, he's starting to build his own cities as well to further consolidate his power. In addition to this, he built diplomatic relations with Fezzan and Tripoli, which we just mentioned were places where he was born and where he studied at. And so now, while Maidu Nama is weakening himself politically, Al-Kanemi is building relations with all of these different areas that his family would have had connections with. And so there are many versions of how Al-Kanemi eventually ended up replacing Maidu Nama on the throne. But in lieu of all of these differences, Louis Brenner and Ronald Cohen note that the story is very popular among the people of Bornu and is related almost without variations. And so as the story goes, Maidu Nama made an attempt to collude with the Sultan of Bagwermi, which is in Nigeria, in 1820 to stage a war against Al-Kanemi. And so the plan was that they were going to surround the cities that Al-Kanemi was in and cut him off politically and geographically, similar to how Idris Aluma did with the Sao people. But when he sent the letter writing his plans to the king of Bagwermi, it actually ended up getting into Al-Kanemi's hands, and then he became aware of his plans to be killed, and then he used that to his advantage to meet Maidu Nama in battle and end up killing him himself. When he killed Maidu Nama, he took the title of Shehu, which in the Kanuri language means Sheikh, which is like a priest or a minister in Islam. And even in lieu of that, he's still being politically shrewd in that while he is in all actuality the most powerful person in Bornu right now, he's still entertaining the idea of the Sefu Amais feeling like they have a sense of power. And so when Maidu Nama dies, he's replaced by his son Ibrahim, and Ibrahim essentially is a king only in name. But Al-Kanemi is letting him feel like he has this sense of rulership so that Ibrahim wouldn't get any feelings of suspect of what Al-Kanemi was actually trying to do. So in 1825, he began to secure Kanam Bournu's western provinces by securing all of the territories that were previously abandoned when the Fulani first started launching their jihads. In particular, there was a place called Katagum, which Al-Kanemi had to launch 2 military campaigns against in the year 1865. And in addition to expanding Kanam Bournu, he also made it a habit to change the way that the kingdom was politically structured. So when the Safua dynasty was on the throne, the vassals of Kanam Bournu were more or less autonomous, which meant that they could do whatever they wanted to do as long as they paid taxes and tribute to the king of Bornu. Al-Kanemi changed that so that now every province of Kanam Bornu had to have somebody who supported him living in that city. And in addition to that, all of these cities were governed from Al-Kanemi's capital in Kukawa instead of being administered in their local territories. And so Al-Kanemi dies in 1837. He's succeeded by his son Umar. After this, we get another period of kings who don't really know how to govern, who don't have a lot of political power. And a lot of his successors we don't actually know a lot about. But that is how Al-Kanemi abolished the Safua dynasty and established the Shehu dynasty. Now, one thing that scholars don't really talk about, and this is also a picture of his burial place in Borno State in northern Nigeria. Now, one thing that scholars don't really talk about is Kanam Bornu's military industry. And so I want to show a quick video just to highlight how strong Kanam Bornu was when Al-Kanemi was on the throne. So I want to show a video, a short video. So I'm going to stop my screen so that I can share it. What we see during Al-Kanemi's reign is that Kanam Bornu was actually manufacturing. If you are not muted, could you please mute yourself? Okay, so when Al-Kanemi was on the throne, Kanam Bournu started a process of manufacturing weapons and manufacturing gunpowder. And so I wanted to show this video that contextualizes what they were doing in the context of West African history in general, where African empires during the 1800s were beginning to collectively make an effort to decrease their reliance on Europeans and on Asians by manufacturing their own weapons. So I want to share this. Let me make sure my sound is on.
Greetings, denizens of the Empire. It's Jabara here. Oftentimes, when we hear of early trade between Europeans and Africans, there is a recurring and unfortunate theme: slaves for guns and vice versa. Kingdoms and empires of the West African coast grew wealthy and powerful from the acquisition of guns that they used to their advantage against their enemies, and unfortunately, these weapons came at the expense of the sale of human beings, the only commodity that Europeans seemed to want in exchange, as there was a shortage of labor in their New World plantations. Oftentimes, this led to a perpetual state of African kings selling slaves in exchange for firearms and subsequently using the firearms to go to war, capture more slaves, and trade them for more firearms, and repeat. One question, however, has lingered with me for a very long time, and I finally got an answer. With so many ancient and advanced blacksmithing traditions of West Africa, why didn't they just make their own guns? Well, you may be surprised by the answer.
Hello, I'm David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. Our humanitarian
Flintlock muskets first began to appear in West Africa in the 16th century, and due to a large quantity of said guns coming from the Danish trade, the term Dane gun became synonymous with early African firearms, whether they originated in Europe or were locally manufactured by Africans themselves. For the sake of this video, however, we are going to focus exclusively on those locally produced, repaired, or modified by African blacksmiths. The Kingdom of Benin had a strong tradition of guilds that were held in high esteem by the royal court. Two distinct guilds emerged during the Oba dynasty of Benin. The first one was known as Igun Nekuha, which was founded during the reign of Oba Oguola. The second was known as Igun Neyain Nugie, established during the reign of Oba Esigie. The primary purpose of these guilds was to produce iron and steel weapons of war of all varieties, including swords, spears, and arrowheads. However, in an effort to reduce the dependence on European gun imports, Oba Akingbuda ordered his guild at Igun N'Ugboha to be reorganized specifically for the purpose of locally manufacturing muskets and cannons. To present day, 3 cannons currently exist in the British Museum that were crafted by Bini blacksmiths, 2 of bronze and 1 of iron. Several British, Portuguese, and even Chinese cannons were also looted from Oba's palace in 1897 and were likely used as models for reference for this indigenous Nigerian arms industry. The replication of these guns was so precise that even the Portuguese Order of Christ symbol was engraved on them by Bini blacksmiths, despite Benin never being a Christian state at any point in pre-colonial times. In the 19th century, this local guild of blacksmiths seems to have still been in existence as outlined in this account by Captain James Faulkner. It excited my surprise to see here 2 or 3 small pieces of cannon of British and Portuguese manufacture, but they were not mounted and had perhaps been procured as models for imitation, as the country abounds in iron. But for the expense attendant on working the mines, there is, comparatively speaking, very little wrought to perfection. I saw, however, some swords of their own manufacture, which were very well turned out of hand, and was credibly informed they could make muskets, with the exception of the lock, in great perfection. It is also important to note that the lock was the same part of the weapon that the Japanese struggled to imitate when firearms were first introduced to them by the Portuguese in the 16th century, as the technique of manufacturing a helix bolt was unique to European blacksmiths. The blacksmiths of Benin, however, were not the only people of West Africa to manufacture their own firearms, nor did they do it at the largest scale. But before we cover that though, I'd like to thank Happy Hippo Herbals for sponsoring this video. Kratom is an alternative medicine that I had to support my channel. So anyway, back to the video. The Wassoulou Empire was a short-lived state that existed in what are now Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Ivory Coast. It was founded by Samori Touré, a powerful and influential Mandinka Muslim. This upstart commander sought to build an empire from the ground up, fully equipped with a modern army. His units were based on the military organization of the Mali Empire and other Mande polities. He succeeded in establishing a professional full-time corps of highly trained soldiers, all wielding muskets and modern breech-loaded rifles. Samori's nascent empire had a total of 50 breech-loading rifles and 36 were carried by a special guard. In 1891, he began importing hundreds of rifles from the newly formed state of Liberia and later the British. He used this military advantage to conquer small neighboring kingdoms and states, and after defeating a French force in 1891, he began importing more weapons due to the increased European threat. By November of the same year, he had stockpiled 2,000 repeating rifles, and after the defeat of the aforementioned French column, his army consisted of 1,000 cavalry and 7,000 infantry. All 1,000 of his cavalry, and approximately half of his infantry, were equipped with these weapons. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that many of these weapons were captured from the French after battle, some were manufactured locally by Wassoulou blacksmiths. In fact, after every battle, all bullet casings were collected and turned in for recycling into new rounds, a practice that is still in fact conducted today at shooting ranges in the United States military, where service members are ordered to collect or police up all expended brass casings. The Wassoulou Empire took it a step further, however, in the fact that it included the expended rounds themselves that were embedded into objects such as trees. This was no doubt due to the rarity of copper and zinc in West Africa, which contributed to the expense of importing the necessary resources for their arms industry. Older style muskets and projectiles could be found to be made locally as well, since trade guns were sold to Africans at the time, which were lower quality and were often dangerous to use or required frequent repairs. Gunpowder was locally manufactured in West Africa in large quantities, but was generally considered to be of lower quality than the European variety, possibly due to the technique of corning being unknown to Africans, a process of moistening gunpowder into a paste with spirits and allowing it to dry into balls before crushing it into grains once more prior to firing, thus creating a more even and consistent burn for the explosive force. However, corning may have been known to West Africans but deliberately ignored, simply because weaker powder would have been far safer to use on these weapons, since their barrels were prone to bursting. In other words, bad muskets needed bad powder. While sulfur was imported from Sudan, all other components of gunpowder were obtained locally. King Behanzin of the Dahomey Kingdom informed a French mission that he had succeeded in manufacturing his own guns and gunpowder. The French reacted in disbelief that the African king had the capability of doing so. However, in 1892, after the French invaded the small kingdom, they found a large quantity of gunpowder, ammo, cartridges, rockets, electric batteries, and several other tools that were needed in the manufacture and repair of cartridges and firearms. They also found 5,000 kilograms of gunpowder, much of which was neatly sealed away in clay jars and barrels. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the neighboring Ashanti locally manufactured brass blunderbusses, which they called humu or ohum. They also had a thriving blacksmith trade completely dedicated to the repair of firearms, and in some cases, the complete manufacture of new barrels, locks, and stocks. Additionally, gunpowder was locally manufactured within the Ashanti Kingdom. Tight cordage was wrapped around barrels to prevent them from bursting, and metal parts were covered in tin and leather to protect them from the corrosion in the rainy and humid climate of the Gold Coast. Coverings of this type are believed to have been supplied by the Ashanti government, and weapons would have been regularly inspected by high-ranking officials to ensure proper maintenance was being conducted by the soldiers. Failure to properly maintain a weapon resulted in heavy fines. So, as mentioned before, guns shipped to Africa known as trade guns were often of low quality and prone to failure. Their durability was not tested to military standards, or what is known as proofing, a process in which the components are tested under heavy pressure to ensure their integrity is up to standard. Trade guns were not intended for repetitive use or rapid firing. Contrary to popular belief, the bulk of muskets imported to Africa were not for warfare, but for use among the common folk for purposes of hunting, self-defense, crop protection, and funeral ceremonies. With that being said, numerous blacksmiths throughout West Africa took up the trade of offering repair services for muskets rather than local manufacture, as it was often much cheaper to purchase complete firearms and then repair them afterwards. The Awka Ibom region of present-day Nigeria has been known for many centuries as a place of blacksmiths. The people here manufactured a type of flint gun in pre-colonial times known as the Egbe Cham. They were also able to make Nkponala, which was a small indigenous cannon, and a more complex version which they called Kurutu or Egbe Ndu. The latter cannon was manufactured in the late 19th century, just prior to the annexation of Nigeria into the British Empire. However, the trade has been systematically eradicated by the British colonial administration, and the final nail in the coffin came after the Nigerian Civil War. Nonetheless, the blacksmiths of this region have continued their work, albeit for manufacture of iron implements of non-military purposes. They are renowned for their skills in this industry so much that the city in which they operate out of is known as Nkwere Opia Egbe, or in English, Nkwere, the gunmakers. Unfortunately, these traditions have begun to fizzle out in recent years due to lack of government support, and instead, a growing interest in the region's petroleum industry is prevailing. In conclusion, firearms in pre-colonial West Africa were primarily owned and used by common folk, and were indigenously repaired and manufactured locally. The blacksmiths of West Africa had the tools and technical knowledge to do so, and succeeded in making guns of all varieties throughout the centuries. Simple flintlock muskets, gunpowder, cannons, rockets, and even breech-loaded repeaters. However, importing guns was always a cheaper alternative, and local initiatives to eliminate dependence on European trade developed in various independent kingdoms of the region. And though these industries had some success, they never took off on a scale comparable to Japan or India, most likely due to the cheaper price and ease of access through trade rather than local manufacturing. Additionally, armies fully equipped with gunpowder weapons was something completely new to West Africa, and those who adopted them on a mass scale were the exception and not the rule. The Dahomey and Ashanti kingdoms were among the few. Asia, however, is quite literally the birthplace of gunpowder, and thus adopting and incorporating European technological advancements into the weapon systems was not only a more natural process, but more necessary due to the already widespread use of gunpowder weaponry on the continent. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Please comment letting me know what you think, and while you're at it, maybe consider hitting the like button, sharing the video, or subscribing, and clicking the notification bell so you never miss any new videos.
All right, so I just wanted to show that video. Let me go back to it. See. Sorry, just trying to share my screen. Okay, here we go. So I just wanted to show that video to set up that West African kingdoms at this time were not just relying on Europeans for weaponry, but they were actually manufacturing their own materials. And I wanted to share that video because we know from different books that were written in the 1800s that this is what Kanam Bournu during the late 1800s would have been doing as well. In a book entitled The Flooding of the Sahara, it was written that some of the inhabitants of Bornu are engaged in several branches of industry, such as weaving, cotton, wool, and dyeing. They form the iron afforded by their country and as such tools as their work requires. They also make gunpowder from the coals prepared from the mimosa. In another book, it is said that among the remarkable manufactures of the country are 20 metal cannons of undetermined caliber, which were cast in Kuka or Kukawa. Another source says the Sultan's bodyguard is a troop of horsemen clad in armor, partly manufactured in Bornu. He even possesses a number of cannons cast in Kuka. And another source talks about how they manufactured their own armor as well. And it says the natives manufacture cotton cloths and coats of mail, which is chain mail, kind of similar to how you would see people in medieval Europe wearing, which they use in warfare. And so that's the first part of this class about the establishment of the Shehu dynasty and some of the activities of Al-Kanemi. And when we come back from the break and from the Q&A, we're going to actually look at the life of an African who lived in Kanam Bournu and got enslaved and went on quite the road trip around the world. But before we get into that, we can stop right here and ask and answer any questions that people might have.
All right, Daniel, thank you. Starting out, I do have a question about the changeover in dynasties and how the Kanemis, or at least Al Kanemi, kept a Mai as almost like a figurehead. Was that maintained after his descendants, or did they stop having Mais altogether at some point?
So when the Al-Kanemi dynasty was established, they stopped having Mais altogether.
Okay. So we don't family, they're just kind of the oral records just go straight into the Shehu dynasty.
Yes.
Okay. question, and I think I see something in the chat. And then Mr. Thomas has his hand up.
Indeed. Hey, Daniel. A few things. Okay, so just so I understand, the video was called "Why Didn't African Kingdoms Make Their Own Guns?" When the answer was, "Hey, they did," right?
Yes, the title was sarcastic.
Go, gotcha. Okay. So then, so this idea that said that I heard the idea of taking the Quran to the sea. So I was wondering, was there these things are always more complex than that. Like I'm assuming that there wasn't just about taking the Quran to the sea, that any kind of campaigns of, conquer or conquering stuff had economic reasons. Actually, that'd be the question. I'm assuming there was economic reasons, and weren't they the main thing as opposed to actually taking the Quran to the sea? Like, what was the relationship between economic interest in conquering people and just taking them, I guess, converting them to Islam?
Yes, they're both very much interrelated. Now, at this time, we did have a lot of people who thought that they were the next caliphs or like great Islamic rulers of the world at this time. So religion definitely did play a huge role into this. But at the same time, we can't deny the economic aspect of it. On one hand, we have Europeans doing the transatlantic slave trade, and on the other hand, we have Arabs in East Africa doing the same thing. So capturing and enslaving Africans is a lucrative business. And if you can use the Quran as like a shield behind which you can hide to justify something else, a lot of people were doing that. So to answer your question, yes, they were religion and economics were both equally important.
We have a question about the calendars. It's coming from David H. It says, from a cultural perspective, what are the different types of calendars used around globally? Was the Kanam Bournu different from the Gregorian calendar? So what was a significant event used to benchmark their beginning or significant measuring point of the Kanam Bournu calendar?
Okay, great question. So the people of Kanam Bournu did not have their own calendar. Those dates that were from the 1200s were from the Islamic calendar. So the Islamic calendar is different from the Gregorian calendar, which is what we use. I actually don't know what the specific point in Islam is that they use to measure that. It has something to do with the Prophet Muhammad, but I don't know if that's when he was born or when he died. But Muslims orient their calendar based off of something in Muhammad's life. But I can definitely look into that and give a more concise answer next weekend. But does that help, David? Does that answer your question?
Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
Morning, all. I'm just trying to find out if there's a stark difference between empire and dynasty.
Yes, I would say there is. An empire is a kingdom or a large state, and a dynasty is just a family to which a series of kings or queens belong to. So empires have dynasties, so they're related, but they're not intrinsically the same thing. Does that answer your question, Mr. Thomas? Do I need to explain that more?
It does partially. So if you could put some more light on it, I would appreciate it.
Okay, so empires can have multiple dynasties. So the Seyfua dynasty was ruled by a bunch of men who more or less came from the same family. They shared the same blood. And the Shehu dynasty was ruled by people who shared the same lineage, who shared the same ancestry. So Dr. Ledbetter, if you could give a more concise definition, I don't know if I can
Yeah, I mean, an example could be one that we're kind of unfortunately more familiar with in terms of us being English-speaking people and being colonized by the British. So England was an empire, but throughout England's history, different families have run that empire. What's the name of the people right now? They're the Windsors, yeah. Then before them, I think it was the Stuarts, and before them was somebody. So there's different families that rule the same empire, but every time it switches families, it switches dynasty.
Thank you.
All right, so go ahead, Daniel. Oh, we got one more question, and then go ahead.
Okay. Rockets? That's one question. I'm just going to one more, hear more about that. And then also, so Al-Kanemi, so was he, did I hear that he was leading the king's army in battle, and the king, and he was doing great. That's why the king gave him a fiefdom, but he also was building his own on the side. Is that what I heard?
Yeah, yes, that is essentially what he was doing. He would work with the Seyfua dynasty on one hand, and at the same time, he would use the status that he had already established and combined that with the gifts that the kings would be giving him to build himself up so that he could exert power on his own.
What I think that's the question. Africans were creating their own rockets.
If that's the question, yes, Africans had been smelting metals for centuries. So obviously you're going to have some people who are like, well, we already know how to mold our metals to make this, that, and the third. So why not just manufacture these guns and these cannons as well? And so there were guilds of metal workers who would acquire physical copies of European weapons, and then they would essentially reverse engineer them. So kind of similar to how like Asian countries do with cars, they'll get like Western models of cars, break them down, and then tear them apart to understand how to put them back together. That's what Africans were doing with cannons and with guns.
And I think it's probably easier to create a rocket than a gun, because just having one projectile go. And again, I'm not a physicist, but I think it's easy. But one more question I had about Al-Kanemi before you go on. Al-Kanemi, his background is being Kanembu and then Shua Arab. Is that reliable, or is his birthplace being in the Fezzan or being somewhere in Libya? Is that a reliable history, or do you think that that was reconstructed to connect him to that trade for his own diplomatic purposes, or is it just the reality of his background?
I think I would say that that's the reality of his background, especially since as he's consolidating his power, Kanem Bornu was getting a larger influx of Arab speaking, well, not Arab speaking peoples, but Arabs into the country. And even as we talk about Nicholas Said, one thing that he mentions is that at his time of living, there were three groups of people who were living in Kanem Bornu. There were the Kanuri people who were the
Oh,
indigenous,
girl, I know you be sweating.
and
I hope you made it.
and then there were like mixed race classes of people, and then there were the Arabs that were there that were brought in. So yes, I do think that is reliable, since I don't think that Arabs would have been there had he not had Arab ancestry.
Okay, interesting. And that's actually a great segue. So, yeah, please continue.
So we looked at how the Al-Kanemi dynasty was established, and now I think it'll be very interesting to look at some things that would have been happening on more of the local or commonalty side of things. And so we have the narrative of an African from Kanem Bornu named Nicholas Said. And his story is very interesting. He was born to a family in Kanam Bournu. He was enslaved in Africa by Tuareg slave traders. Through that, he was moved to multiple cities in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe, where he was living in the houses of different masters. He was freed by a Russian prince, and then he went to the United States, where he ended up fighting as a Union soldier in the American Civil War. And while he was in the United States, he actually became a school teacher as well. And at the time of coming to the US, he was fully fluent in at least 9 languages, being Kanuri, which would have been his ancestral language, Mandara, which is a Central African language, Arabic and Turkish, Russian, German, Italian, French, and English. And as he talks about in his autobiography, not all of these languages were languages that he had to learn by virtue of being enslaved, but a lot of these were languages that he wanted to learn. He was a very inquisitive person, and he actively went out of his way to like study grammar textbooks to find people who would be able to teach him so that he could expand his horizons. Now, now we know about his life from 2 sources. He's written 2 autobiographies of himself. The first was an article he wrote in 1867 in a magazine called The Atlantic Monthly. This was only about 10 or 11 pages, and he gives very surface level information about his life. But then in a few years after that, he wrote his autobiography in 1873. Now, unfortunately, his autobiography was lost pretty much from the time it was first published until 2000, when a student at Harvard University named Precious Muhammad found it. So for most of the century, 2 centuries since he wrote his autobiography, it's only his smaller work that he's really been known for, because his bigger work, which has most of the details about his life, wasn't known about until fairly recently. But from his testimony, we know that he was born in Kanam Bournu at some point around 1836 in the and he says in his own words, I was born in Kuka, the capital of the Kingdom of Bornu in Sudan. A few years after the invasion of the Wadais, or about the year 1836 of the Christian era. I was the 13th child of my mother, who bore 19 children, 7 girls and 12 boys. My father was the elder son of Katzala Malagimu, the ruling chief of Malagoy, a small country south of and tributary to Bornu. What's interesting is that his father, from his testimony, was actually one of the warriors who would have been Al-Kanemi's closest military generals. In his own words, he says, my father greatly distinguished himself under our immortal king, Muhammad el-Amin ben Muhammad el-Kanemi, the Washington of Bornu, and for most of his efficient services in repelling the Fellas, or Fulani, from Bornu, created him Katzala, or general, and made him generalissimo of his army, which he afterwards commanded for upwards of 25 years with great distinction. He tells us that when he was about 12 or 13 years old, the kingdom of Bagwermi, which, as we've seen, was where Mai Dunama tried to conspire with, they waged a war on the city of Angala, which was one of Bornu's provinces. And Nicholas Said's father was involved in a counterattack to this. And in this fight, he, along with 3 of his sons, died in battle. And after this happened, Nicholas Said was sent to live with a man named Katori, who was a Malam, or Islamic teacher. And he got Islamic training from him. In his autobiography, he talks about how his life there was very strict, how he and his colleagues, who would have also been very young boys, would get beat for the smallest offenses. And he also talks about how he was a little bit of a rabble rouser, and how there would be times when he should be in class, but he would actually sneak out of school to go play games or to do anything except learning, and then his malam would catch him and then beat him for being disobedient. But when he was with this Islamic teacher for 3 years, he and some of his other schoolboys were enslaved by Tuareg slave traders. The way he describes the incident was that one day while they were in school, they were taking a break, and so they went outside and they climbed a baobab tree to get some fruits to eat because they were hungry. And while they were up in the trees, they heard people shouting, Tuaregs, Tuaregs, Tuaregs. And they pulled up on cavalry forces on horses, and those some of them have fallen from the trees and they have been captured that way. Nicholas Said said that he just so conveniently happened to be on the tallest branch of the tree, but out of a burst of fear, he fell from the tree and hit his head on the ground and got unconscious. And when he woke up, he found himself on the back of a horse. So he says that after they were captured, they were taken to the Hausa city of Kachna, which we know is Katsina, which was 10 days away from Bornu. He says, I was sold to a man half Arab and half African, a most ferocious and cruel looking individual. I was terribly afraid of him at first, but after a while, I discovered he was not quite the monster he seemed. He had about 20 slaves of both sexes from Hausa, Falada, and Timbuktu. Abd al-Qadir, my new master, remained at Kachna about 3 months, during which time he beat me very often because I was becoming emaciated with grief and pinning for my home. After 3 months of living with Abd al-Qadir in Hausaland, they went to Zinder, which would be in I believe Niger, and then from there they went to Fazan in Libya. In Libya, Abd al-Qadir found out about who Nicholas Said's father was. He was apparently well familiar with the great military might that his father possessed. And so recognizing who he was, Nicholas Said says like he was beginning to be treated a lot nicer and a lot better on account of who his father was. But Nicholas Said didn't want to stay with Abd al-Qadir because being with him means that the long trek they would have had to go from West Africa across the Sahara Desert to North Africa, he would have had to undergo that entire uncomfortable process again to go back home. So he said, unwilling to recross the inhospitable Sahara, I begged him to sell me to the Turks, who I had heard were very good masters. And thus he was sold to a man named Abdi, who was an officer in the Pasha's army. So he was sold to an official in Tripoli, which is a country in North Africa. And then his autobiography goes on to describe what his life was like living under this master in Tripoli. So he says that after 6 months in Tripoli, which at this time would have been a part of the Ottoman Empire, Abdi had informed me that he was going to send me to his father in Tripoli. Now, this was obviously something that would have been very uncomfortable for him because he was scared of being abused because, being enslaved, that's not a comfortable position. But he says that the name of my new master was Haj Dawood, and he had only one wife, an Arab woman. He had, however, as concubines, two black girls, one a native of Bornu and the other from Hausa. And he goes on to talk about how his new master's wife, this Arab woman, had actually developed a very deep hatred of him for no reason. And so, because Haj Dawood loved Nicholas Said so much, he prevented her from abusing him and from beating him. But he talks about how, for no reason, she had this insane hatred for him. While he was living in Tripoli, he became very fluent in the Turkish language. And he says, during my stay in Tripoli, I learned to speak the Turkish language tolerably, so much so indeed as to surprise everyone who was acquainted with me. And at some point during his time in Tripoli, he accompanied Hajj Dawood on the Hajj, or the Muslim pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. At this time, Nicholas Said was a Muslim because Kanam Bournu was a Muslim country. And so he was ecstatic when Hajj Dawood asked him to go on the pilgrimage with him. Now, Hajj Dawood was described as being a man who was about 50 years old, give or take, and he had made the pilgrimage every 10 years, Said tells us. And so this instance where he went would have been his fourth time going and making the Hajj in 40 years. And so Nicholas Said was ecstatic at the opportunity to undergo this huge pilgrimage, which is a crucial tenet of his faith at the time. On their return from Mecca, however, Hajj Dawood was informed by a friend that his business had been destroyed in a fire, which caused him to lose a lot of wealth. And so, in order to make up for that wealth, Nicholas Said was informed that Hajj Dawood would be compelled to sell me. And so he was ended up being sold a second time to a friend of Hajj Dawood, Fuad Pasha, who took him to Constantinople. And so he went to the city of Istanbul and Constantinople. And after only 9 months of being there, Fuad Pasha had planned to sell Nicholas Said a third time to his brother Rashid Pasha. And very sadly, Said began this time to think that it was my fate to pass from hand to hand with never a sure and definite resting place. And unfortunately, this wouldn't be the last time that he would be sold to other people either. There was a Russian prince at the time named Anatol Menshikov, and he was one of Rashid Pasha's closest friends. And he took a very strong liking to Nicholas Said. And so after much compromise and negotiations, Nicholas Said ended up being sold a fourth time to this Russian prince. In the Ukrainian city of Odessa, and Anatol Menshikov plays Nicholas Said in charge of his son, Prince Peter, while he had to attend business back in Constantinople. And so during his time in Odessa, Prince Peter had procured for me an instructor to teach me the Russian language. So now Nicholas Said speaks his native Kanuri language. He also learned how to speak Arabic through his Islamic education under Malam Katori. And now he had learned the Turkish language, and now he's learning Russian as well. Now during the late 1800s, Tsar Nicholas, who would have been the king of Russia, and Sultan Abdul Majid, who was the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, they began to have a conflict, which is known historically as the Crimean War. Now, this fighting forced Prince Menshikov to relocate to St. Petersburg in Russia. And when he moved, Nicholas Said accompanied him to Russia. Now, Prince Menshikov was a well-respected diplomat, and when the war got so intense that he was forced to give his military services, he had to leave Nicholas Said with his family under the promise that they would take very good care of him. But much to his dismay, Said found that when he was with his family, the treatment I received from the other servants became so intolerable that I was forced, much to my regret, to seek a situation elsewhere. And so he had to go somewhere else for his servitude. But he notes that while it was during his time in Russia that he became a Christian, he reverted from Islam and became a Christian. And in his own words, he says, I was baptized in Riga on the 12th of November, 1855, leaving my Mohammedan name of Muhammad Ali Ben Said at the front and bearing there from the Christian name of Nicholas. And so in Russia, he and his master Prince Menshikov went throughout Europe. They went to multiple countries such as Austria, Rome, Paris, and England. And while in England, he learned another language. He learned English. In his own words, he says, I worked hard to learn the English language, so by the time I left there, I laid a very good foundation upon which to build afterwards. In spring 1867, Nicholas Said became overwhelmed with a sense of mourning and longing to want to go back to Africa. And so he says in his autobiography that he spoke to Prince Menchikov about going back to Africa, and his master laughed at him and basically talked about how ridiculous that idea was. And so after much negotiation and going back and forth, they had an agreement that he would be allowed to go back to Africa only on the condition that he would come back to his master in Russia after a year. So Nicholas Said, eager to go back to his motherland, agreed to these terms and conditions. And so he set sail for Africa. Here he was directed to a man who he says was named Sandros Rachushin. And this man was planning on getting married and going on a bridal tour in North America. And he asked Nicholas Said to accompany him in this tour throughout North America so that when he goes back to Africa, he can have all of these experiences that he had never undergone before that he can share with his native people back home. You know, obviously that would be detracting his plans. He's already been in all these different countries. Like, why would you want to go somewhere else? But evidently he agreed to go on this trip. And so they set sail, and their first destination was Boston, Massachusetts. And from there, they went to New York. And from there, they went to Haiti. That's the real name for Haiti. And then from there, they went to Nassau, which is described as the capital of the Caribbean. At some point after that, they went to Canada, where last second plans caused Rachushin to leave him in Canada. And so alone in Canada, Nicholas Said had no money, but fortunately he met a reverend there who was able to supply him with enough money to go to the United States. And so when he goes to America, he says that he decided to go south where I can make great use of my benighted people in the capacity of a teacher. And so he went to Charleston, South Carolina, where he chose to teach. Now, that's pretty much where his first autobiography, where his bigger autobiography, ends. But the editor of his first autobiography, which was much shorter, made some footnotes in his narrative. So Nicholas Said actually didn't talk about his military service in the United States for one reason or another. And so the only reason that we know that he was a Union soldier was because the person who edited his first autobiography in the Atlantic Monthly had annotated footnotes and had met and known him personally. And so the person who edited his first memoir says, at Detroit, he enlisted in a colored regiment in the summer of 1863. He served faithfully and bravely with his regiment as corporal and sergeant in the Department of the South, and near the close of the war was attached at his own request to the hospital department to acquire some knowledge of medicine. He was mustered out with the company in which he served in the fall of 1865. But alas for his plans of service to his countrymen in his native land, like many a warrior before him, he fell captive to a woman, married at the South, and for some time past, the writer, amidst changes of business, has entirely lost sight of him. So in other words, Nicholas Said enlisted as a Union soldier in one of the black colored military regiments in 1863, and he fought in the Civil War until its end in 1865. While he was fighting as a soldier, he wanted to learn about medicinal sciences, and so he started to work for the hospital in the army, and then he ended up getting married, and that's where our knowledge of his life ends. So he evidently didn't end up going back to Africa. He marries a woman, presumably an African woman, and then he falls off the radar. We know from one other source that he probably died and was buried in Tennessee, but we don't have much conclusive evidence to substantiate or negate that either way. But that is the life of Nicholas Said, the African from Kanam Bournu, who went on a world tour, if you will, and became an American Union veteran. So that concludes our class for this week. Next week, we're going to talk about the Shehu kings who came after Al-Kanemi, and we're going to talk about the influence that the British and that the French had in Kanam Bournu at this time. But that concludes our session for today. And so now I will open it up for Q&A.
All right, thank you, Daniel. Keep that up for a second, because I did have a question, because something's off on the narrative. Go back maybe two slides. Yeah, okay, this one. It says he in spring 1867, he wanted to return to Africa. Is that when he's still in Europe?
Yes, this was when he was in Europe. So maybe there was an editing error with I'm not sure. 1867 is the date that Nicholas Said gave. So, maybe he didn't remember the actual date or
Yeah, because I mean, the Civil War is over. I mean, Civil War is only 1861 to 65. So do you think, or could it be, so this is the later autobiography, and he doesn't mention the war. So do you think maybe the person that wrote the Atlantic got him mixed up with somebody else? Or because it would seem strange that he didn't talk about it. Or doesn't talk about marriage or anything like that. It's interesting.
yeah, I'm not sure. I can go back and double check the autobiography. I'm confident that he said it was 1867, but that could
No, I
definitely
believe
make
you. I believe you. I'm saying I think the the Atlantic Monthly, I wonder if whoever wrote that or whoever put that footnote in is adding to a narrative that maybe they were wrong about, or maybe they thought he was somebody else, or could go back to the footnote, because he doesn't talk about it, and then you said that was a footnote, right? Like that wasn't in the actual body of the narrative.
Yes. So the way the article was structured, the editor talked a little bit about who Nicholas Said was, and then he put snippets from the autobiography that he was sent, and then he put some closing remarks. And so this passage
Uh,
right here is from those closing remarks.
I wonder if somebody messed up because he might have him confused with some other African or something like that. Because why would he not? Why would Saeed not mention it in his own narrative? Like that seems such a big thing, and yeah, it doesn't seem. It's interesting. I got to read the autobiography more carefully because I want to see what other historians say about this, because this was published in 67 and he publishes his autobiography in 73. So that's interesting. But thank you. I think there might be other questions. I don't want to monopolize the time, but I'm going to want to check that out. I think Robin has something. Anyone else, please raise your hand and you can put it in the chat.
Yeah, hey Daniel. I'm a little tired, so I may have missed this. But so Nicholas Said, in terms of his connection to Kanam Bournu, he was born there. But what other what significant things did he do that relate to Kanam Bournu? Like the story was, it was a sad story. The brother getting sold all over the place. But what's his significance to Kanam Bournu? Like, was he a player? How's he fit into the story?
So his father was one of the soldiers who helped Al-Kanemi in his military campaigns.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see we don't get a lot of narratives of enslaved people, with the exception of Equiano and a couple others, to actually talk about that process of capture, sold all these places around, and can recount it in that way. And it's really interesting to see all his connection to so many events in world history. I mean, the Crimean War and the Ottomans, and I wish there was a map to show exact, because it's easier to appreciate if you could see it graphically, all these places that he ends up. And his life is almost a microcosm of what was going on with African people caught in the slave trade. Because he's one of the few people that get caught in both, essentially, going across the Atlantic as well as going through that Arab world as well, and being able to see it from both angles. You have very few Africans that have both of those experiences. Oh, you have a question in the chat. Is the autobiography and the Benin video available on the website?
No, they are not. His autobiography is actually too big a file to put on the course website. So I have the link to the PDF, so I can put that in the chat if anybody wants to go and read it for themselves. But I didn't want to put that in for you all, but unfortunately they were saying this file is too big.
Now, wasn't it originally in Arabic? Did he write it in Arabic, or I'm thinking of something else?
No, his autobiographies were written in English.
Okay.
To the question in the chat. So yes, the first autobiography in the Atlantic Monthly is on the course website, but his bigger autobiography is not. So I'll put a link to that in the chat. While I'm looking for that, David, go ahead.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the course.